On 29 October 2022, the Itaewon district in Seoul, South Korea was packed with people celebrating Halloween. It was the first Halloween without outdoor mask rules since the pandemic started. Everyone was excited, but by the end of the night, not all people would make it out alive.
South Korea declaring a national period of mourning after a deadly crowd surge.
Nearly 160 young people were killed when they got trapped in an overcrowded alleyway in Seoul as they celebrated Halloween.
The Itaewon tragedy was not a freak accident. It was not a sudden stampede of panicked people. It was a mathematical certainty caused by bad urban design, the cold law of physics, and a total breakdown in government authority. To understand how 159 people lost their lives simply by walking down the street, we have to look at the anatomy of a crowd crush. The disaster did not happen across the whole neighborhood. It was isolated to one specific location. Itaewon is famous for its nightlife. It is built on a hill, with a main road at the bottom and a busy street full of restaurants and bars at the top. To get from the main road to the bars, you have to walk up narrow alleys. The most popular alley sits right next to the famous Hamilton Hotel. It connects directly to exit 1 of the Itaewon subway station. When people leave the subway, this alley is the faster way to get to the party. But this alley is a geographical trap. First, it is incredibly short. It is only about 40 meters long. Second, it is dangerously narrow. At its narrowest point, it is only 3.2 meters wide. That is about 10 feet. It is barely wide enough for a small car, let alone thousands of people. Finally, and most importantly, it is on a slope. The alley goes down at a 10% angle. On a normal day, this slope and this narrow width are not a problem. But on a Halloween night, this alley became a funnel. You had tens of thousands of people trying to move up the hill from the subway, and tens of thousands of people trying to move down the hill from the bars. They were all squeezing into a 10-foot wide space. To understand why this is so deadly, we have to understand how human crowds work. When you are walking down a busy street, there are usually 1 or 2 people per square meter. You can walk at your normal speed. You can stop, turn around, and tie your shoe. You are completely free to move around. When a crowd reaches 3 or 4 people per square meter, things get uncomfortable. You might bump shoulders. You have to slow down, but at least you still have your own space to move around. The danger begins when a crowd reaches 6 or 7 people per square meter. At this density, a terrifying change happens. The crowd stops acting like a group of individual humans. Instead, the crowd begins to follow the physical laws of fluid dynamics. The crowd had turned into a liquid. At 7 people per square meter, you cannot lift your arms. You cannot turn around. If the crowd moves forward, you move forward. You are swept up in a river of human bodies. In a crowd crush, nobody can move at all. The cause of death in a crowd crush is rarely trampling. People do not die because they are stepped on. They die from something called compressive asphyxia. When thousands of people are packed tightly together in a narrow space like the Itaewon alley, the physical pressure is enormous. People are pushed against the walls, and they are pushed against each other. Every time you breathe out, the crowd squeezes in a little bit closer. Eventually, the pressure on your chest becomes so heavy that your lungs physically cannot expand. People in a crowd crash die standing straight up, completely unable to take a single breath in. The pressure from the crowd can bend steel fences. A human ribcage stands no chance. Because the crowd has become almost fluid, if just one person trips and falls, the space they leave behind is instantly filled by the people around them. This will trigger a chain reaction within the crowd, creating a shockwave of several thousand pounds that pushes forward. The most heartbreaking part of the Itaewon tragedy is that it did not happen suddenly. It was a slow build-up of pressure, and the police was warned about it hours before anyone died. At 6:34 p.m., nearly 4 hours before the incident, the police received a call. The caller was standing in the exact alley next to the Hamilton Hotel. The caller specifically told the police dispatcher that the alley was too crowded, people were falling, and they felt like they were going to crush to death. The caller explicitly called for the police to come and control the flow of people, but the police did not close the alley. At 8:09 p.m., another call came in. The caller said people were being pushed and falling down, and that there were way too many people. At 8:33 p.m., another call. At 8:53 p.m., another call. At 9 p.m., another call. Over the course of the evening, 11 different emergency calls were made from that specific area. Callers repeatedly used words like crush, panic, and emergency. They were giving the authority real-time situation that a disaster was happening right in front of them. But the dispatchers assumed it was just normal Halloween noise. They thought it was just people complaining about a busy party. The authorities failed to recognize the density of the crowd had crossed the line into extreme danger. They had the information, but they did not act on it. By 10 p.m., the alley was completely blocked. The density had reached the fatal limits of fluid dynamics. People were trapped. The alley acted as a T-junction. At the top of the hill, people were trying to leave the crowded bus and go down to the subway. At the bottom of the hill, people were coming out of the subway and trying to push up the alley. These two massive forces met in the middle of the narrow street. At roughly 10:15 p.m., the balance finally broke. Somewhere in the middle of that 10-foot wide bottleneck, someone slipped onto the downward slope. Because the crowd was so dense, they could not stabilize themselves. They fell. The person next to them lost their balance and fell on top of them. Because of the 10% slope, gravity multiplied the force of falling crowd. A massive shockwave ripped through the alley. Within seconds, hundreds of people collapsed forward down the hill like a line of dominoes. The human liquid crashed. At the bottom of the pile, people were trapped under up to 7 layers of human bodies. The weight of the people on top made it impossible for the people on the bottom to breathe. First responders arrived quickly, but they were powerless. When police and paramedics tried to pull people out of the pile, they could not move them. The bodies were wedged together so tightly by the pressure of the crowd that pulling a single person out felt like trying to pull a brick out of solid wall. In the aftermath of the tragedy, the world asked one simple question: why were there no crowd control measures? Why were there no one-way walking systems or police blocking the alley before it got too full? The answer reveals a terrifying loophole in how governments handle public safety. If you hold a concert or a protest, it is considered an organized event. There is a central organizer. That organizer has to get permits, hire security, and submit a safety plan to the government. Because of this paperwork, the police know exactly what their legal role is. But Halloween in Itaewon is not a ticketed event. There is no central organizer. It is just tens of thousands of individuals deciding to go to the same neighborhood on the same night. Because it was an unorganized gathering, the local government and the police felt they had no legal obligation to set up crowd control barriers. They did not have a disaster manual for a spontaneous crowd. The bureaucracy was paralyzed by a lack of paperwork. The police who were sent to the area were mostly focused on catching drug users and stopping fights, not on monitoring crowd density. They treated an emergency like a standard law enforcement problem. Ultimately, this tragedy was allowed to happen because of a bureaucratic failure, a systematic paralysis that left authority ignoring desperate warnings until it was too late. Thank you for watching.